My mid-tour leave was scheduled for December through Christmas and New Year's, with Fonseca following me once I got back. As the time drew closer to my leave dates, I really struggled with the idea of leaving theater, especially leaving Fonseca. We had grown as close as you can in a combat zone, heavily relying on each other for emotional support, even if we try to hide those emotions. He slept 2 feet away from me in the barracks, and if I went to chow, he went to chow. We were inseparable to the point that in our squad sign-out board, we just started writing our combined names, Fonzinia, because everyone understood that where one was, so was the other. When we were mounted, he would drive and I would gun, and when we were dismounted, we were a battle buddy team. Our closeness grew in part because we really did not trust our team leader to make good decisions under fire. S.E. Hurst was a bulletproof combat leader, but our E5 team leader, although a great dude, left us more dependent on relying on each other. Fonseca had a great way about him, and as I try to describe him, I struggle to find the correct words to build him up. When we would pull a 6-hour guard shift after an 18-hour mission, he was always the one to keep us awake. He came up with every word game you could think of, along with every hypothetical question known to man just to keep us talking and awake. You can't help but bear your true self during these times, and no topic was off limits. To have someone know your true self down to your soul and still want to be your friend is an indescribable feeling. This bond is stronger than blood. Family is the source of the military brotherhood that the civilian world struggles to understand. My leave time arrived, and on a pre-dawn December morning I grabbed my bag and walked out of our barracks. I was awake before anyone else, and as Fonseca slept, I had an overwhelming urge to wake him up and tell him that I loved him. I squashed this urge and told myself that grown-ass men don't tell their friends that they love unless they were gay. I justified it that this brotherly love didn't need to be expressed and that he probably knew that I considered him closer to me than my own blood brother, so why wake him for something so trivial? How do I adequately explain the experience of going from near constant combat, living in a bombed outbuilding, burning your shit, and showering once a week from a water bottle to a world that barely knows where Iraq is? I picked up my son in Omaha and flew with him to visit my parents in Texas. It was surreal, and I struggled to understand how my shared combat experiences were not front-page news. Americans had the audacity to continue to live their lives as if we were not facing death every single day. A spark of anger and resentment started to kindle in the bottom of my soul. This spark would slowly build into a raging flame that controlled me and my emotions for many years to come. But for the moment, I was focused on living it up while I had the chance. Fonseca had agreed to call me after a week just to let me know he was okay and fill me in on everything I was missing, but I never received that call. I did not sweat it too much, because every time someone was wounded or killed, the MWR went into a comms blackout until the families were notified. This was not just for our BN, but the whole brigade. If someone in 1-9 IN died across the city, MWR comms went black. I did not think too hard on this and just went wild. Victoria, Texas is not a very large city, but has grown over the years, thanks to oil and gas booms. One night, I went to a country western bar with a childhood friend and proceeded to get stuttering drunk. I remember seeing a guy I went to high school with and laughed internally because he was the stereotypical I peaked in high school type. Balding, a little chubby, and still prowling local bars. How could he sit here when there was a war going on? Why wasn't he doing his part? I started to get angry and just wanted to push his stupid war-dodging face in with my fist. I let it slide because I was working on this young Hispanic woman sitting close to me. That mission ended up being a success, but I don't remember getting to her place. My buddy waited for me outside in my truck as I drunkenly proceeded to seduce this woman, whose name I had forgotten before we even left the bar. I add this story because this, to me, was the first indicator of who I was turning into. I was reckless and full of rage. Surviving so many close calls, witnessing so many terrible things, had turned off a piece of my humanity and reserve. Fuck it, I'm going to get it in while I can before I become another number in this war. No one knew what we were going through, and how could I explain it? So reckless abandonment became the theme of my life after that. One night I had an extremely vivid dream. It was close to the end of my time, and I had not heard from anyone, so I was starting to get concerned and was anxious to get back to Corregidor. I was all alone with my rifle, on some random street in Ramadi. I climbed up to a roof and my rifle turned into a sniper rifle, so I scanned for targets. As I scanned, it was eerily silent, and before I had a chance to react, I saw a muzzle flash and was shot in my head. I didn't die, but I was left there, eyes open, immobile, and unable to cry out. As I lay on this roof, I saw my platoon walking down an alley on a patrol. I struggled to scream out and warn them of the impending ambush, but I was just silently screaming in my head. In an instant, gunfire erupted, and explosions rocked the scene. I was thrust awake with a gasp and found myself alone in my childhood room, drenched in sweat, heart beating as if I had just run a marathon. Until then, this was the most vivid and lucid dream I had ever had, and it bothered the shit out of me. 2 days later, I took my son back to Omaha and began my journey back to Iraq. My transit airport was DFW, and while I waited there, I ran into our platoon medic, Doc Heath, who had gone on leave the same time as I had. His duties were taken up by my buddy, Bittinger, who was EMT certified, and he acted as the platoon medic until Doc Heath came back. I greeted him and asked if he heard anything about the platoon while we were gone. Doc looked confused and told me that Smith had been killed, along with SSG Vitaliano, PFC Greer, and Fonseca. My world started spinning and I had to find my voice to ask him to say all that again. He was confused and thought I had known already. He apologized, but I barely heard him. The world around me went into a muffled chaos and I struggled to make it to a payphone. I dialed my parents' house and wanted to speak to my dad, but my mom answered, and I immediately unloaded explosive sobs. I kept repeating, "They killed him, those fuckers killed him." I didn't even give her a chance to try to talk to me in between my sobs. I was a ghost and floated through the gate and onto the plane. I had a side row all to myself and all I can remember of that long flight was laying down and crying. I didn't eat any meals, didn't acknowledge any flight attendant, and just cried for 10 hours. A few out there reading this know this pain. I am not poetic enough to properly describe this, but I can tell you that this is the only time I have uncontrollably sobbed for the loss of any human in my life. By the time we landed in Kuwait, I was numb to the world. My only thought was to get back to 3rd Platoon and be amongst my brothers and people who understood me. All around me in Kuwait were Air Force and Army individuals who had no idea what loss was, let alone a real combat deployment. None of the rear echelon motherfuckers could understand the world as they walked around in their pressed DCUs, eating 3 full meals a day in a catered chow hall. A bad day for them was if the internet was too slow. I needed out of there and to be back among people who I understood and understood me. Shared misery builds unbreakable bonds. The travel back from the States and to Iraq is at least a week long, with many transit stations along the way. With all this time to think, all I could do was dwell on Fonseca. How could God take this young man with so full of life, who had so much to look forward to? He had just gotten married and had a whole life ahead of him. Fonseca's life revolved around his family, and especially his little nephew, whom he always talked about. He was so caring, so young, and such a good person and much better than me. Why him and not me? Why is it always the best and brightest of us that are taken? We had lost a lot of great NCOs and soldiers, and they were all the best of us. Doc Meyer was killed earlier in December and was a huge loss. I remember him and the other medics, back in Korea, getting drunk and giving themselves IVs in the dark. He was a dedicated doc and took great care of everyone. He even gave me an 4 before the EIB Ruck March to help me hydrate. His platoon walked into an alley ambush on December 2, 2004, with Doc Meyer being wounded in the leg in the initial contact. He was pulled back, but there was 2 of his guys left in the alley, wounded and still under fire. Doc didn't even hesitate. He got up, ignoring his wound, and ran back into the alley to drag his guys out. In the process, he was shot again and died shortly after, but he saved his guys. He willingly and readily gave his life to save those he cared for the most. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. SSG Vitaliano was very famous in RBN. A former Marine rumored former underwear model, and a tabbed former Ranger Battalion guy. He was larger than life and the poster boy for the Army infantry. With his chiseled jawline and combat, He was one of the best squad leaders in the BN. Everyone loved and respected him. He was in 1st Platoon Charlie, but wherever he was, you knew. On the morning of January 17, 2005, Charlie conducted a company-sized mission into sector with 1st and 3rd Platoons dismounted and Dog Platoon acting as the mounted cordon. Everything from here forward is a combination of the first-hand accounts told to me by everyone in the platoon. SSG Vitaliano was conducting a dismounted patrol when a suspicious car drove up to them, catching the eye of Vitaliano. He had 2 soldiers with him, Greer, and for the life of me I cannot remember the other guy, and approached the vehicle. At some point, Vitaliano realized this was a VBIED and called out, simultaneously grabbing one of his soldiers and shielding him from the impending blast. In his last action in this world, SC Vitaliano grabbed his soldier, shielded him with his body, and saved that soldier's life. PFC Greer, along with SSG Vitaliano, were killed in the blast. SSG Vitaliano was posthumously awarded the Silver Star for his actions. This explosion was the signal to start an AQI-coordinated ambush on Charlie Company. 3rd Platoon, a few blocks away, immediately came under oppressive fire. SSG Hurst and my squad were pinned down on a rooftop by 2 to 3 different machine gun positions. Ortega was up there at this time, but Fonseca was on the street below. With me not being there, he did not want to be under our team leader and approach SSG Hurst about his concerns. SSG Hurst then talked him into SFC Jusino's driver position since Doc had gone on leave. Fonseca started receiving fire from another position but was in an alleyway under cover and not at his truck. At some point, he made the decision to get to the truck and secure it. While sprinting to the truck, he was hit in the lower abdomen. Ortega heard this moment, even over the deafening sounds of combat. It was the unmistakable voice of Fonseca saying in his quasi-sarcastic way as if he just stubbed his toe. There was another soldier in the alleyway with him, I was told. Etzidi, a Native American in another squad whom we were casual friends with. As Fonseca lay in the middle of this street, Etzidi sat there and did not make any attempt to go to his aid. Or so this is what I let myself believe for many years. The truth of the matter is he was most likely pinned down and unable to move, just like the rest of the platoon. Putting this judgment on him is something I regret to this day. What I do know is that SFC Jusino selflessly ran out into the open, under intense fire, grabbed Fonseca, and got him back to cover. Bittinger was called down and went to work trying to stop the bleeding, but Fonseca was hit in the upper groin/abdomen, right in the femoral artery. Bittinger watched the light fade from Fonseca's eyes as he furiously tried to keep him alive, begging him to stay with us. Bittinger had to be pulled off Fonseca because he refused to let him go. Fonseca slipped from this mortal life on January 17, 2005, near Market Street in the Malab district of Ar Ramadi, Iraq. He was 19 years old and left behind a young wife and a loving family. Fonseca wasn't even a citizen yet, having joined the army with his green card, yet here he was. We had talked before I left on leave about how he was trying to get his wife from Mexico to the States, to the point he hired a coyote to get her across the border. They had gotten married so soon before our deployment, he didn't have time to get here immigration paperwork together. They had been married less than a year and he is buried in Delgado, Jalisco, Mexico. Ortega later told me when they finally got back to the aid station, he realized Fonseca was gone. But in combat, there is not much time to grieve, and before he had a chance to process this, they got the call to mount back up and head right back into the city. This is how it goes. Combat soldiers are faced with the most horrendous and psychologically damaging events of their lives, but then forced to stow their emotions away and continue the fight. We do not get the luxury of processing grief or mourning friends. Mission first. You carry on and make sure all the death and destruction were not in vain. By the time we get home, there is too much to unpack, and by this time, we don't want to revisit all the pain and misery. So, we carry on the long tradition, shoving it all down until it explodes in the unhealthiest way.